James buys a rental property. Laura puts the same money into index funds. They both think they made the smarter move. They're both partly right and partly wrong, because one of them forgot to count the hours and the other forgot to count the leverage. When you actually run the numbers over 20 years, side by side, dollar for dollar, the result is not what either of them expected. Let's keep this fair. James and Laura both have $60,000 saved. They both earn $58,000 a year. Same age, same city, same starting line. The only thing that's different is what they do with that $60,000. James uses it as a 20% down payment on a $300,000 rental property, a plain 3-bedroom house in a stable, unremarkable neighborhood. He takes out a 30-year mortgage at 7% interest on the remaining $240,000. His monthly mortgage payment lands around $597. He finds a tenant willing to pay $2,100 a month. On paper, that's roughly $500 a month in profit before he's spent a single dollar on anything else. James feels, understandably, like he just outsmarted everyone he knows. Laura takes the same $60,000 and drops it straight into a total stock market index fund. No leverage, no tenants, no keys to hand over. She sets up an automatic contribution of $350 a month and mostly forgets about it. When people ask what she's investing in, she says index funds, and the conversation moves on immediately because nobody has ever thrown a dinner party around a brokerage statement. On day one, James has a house, a tenant, and a story. Laura has a login and a confirmation email. It isn't close in terms of how it feels, but feelings and math have never been the same thing. And that gap between how something feels and what it actually returns is exactly where most people make this decision wrong. Nobody sits down with a spreadsheet before choosing a side in the real estate versus stocks debate. They pick based on which YouTube video they watched last, which uncle made money flipping a duplex in 2015, or which app made investing feel effortless enough to try. That's not a criticism, it's just how humans make decisions. But it means almost nobody actually knows which choice would have made them richer, because almost nobody runs the full 20-year comparison before committing. The early years, everything feels real for James for the first stretch. James is living the version of landlord life you see in every buy real estate video. Rent lands in his account on the first of the month. He drives past the house on his way to work and thinks, that's mine. He claims mortgage interest and depreciation on his taxes, which quietly knocks a couple $1,000s off his bill every year. Every mortgage payment builds a little more equity. Comparable homes nearby are ticking upward in value. The whole thing feels tangible, active, and smart, because it is all three of those things. Laura, meanwhile, checks her account maybe once a quarter. Year one, her $60,000 grows to roughly $66,000. Year two, something like $73,000. Nothing about it feels like progress. There's no key in her pocket, no tenant texting her about a leaking faucet, nothing she can point to out the car window. James's friends ask him about the rental at every gathering. Nobody asks Laura anything. The social math alone makes James feel like he's winning by a wide margin. Year three, the numbers start talking back. By year three, James has collected roughly $75,600 in rent. His mortgage payments over that period total about $57,500. That leaves $18,100 in gross cash flow, which sounds excellent, right up until you subtract everything else that comes with owning a house. Property taxes run close to $3600 a year. Insurance adds another $1,700. He's already replaced a failing water heater for $1,300, patched a roof leak for $2,600, and absorbed 6 weeks of vacancy between his first and second tenant, which cost him roughly $2,900 in lost rent, plus another $700 to clean and relist the unit. He's managing the property himself to avoid paying someone else, which means late evening phone calls, weekend showings, and coordinating contractors during his lunch break. After every real cost is accounted for, James's actual net cash flow over those 3 years is somewhere around $2,500 to $4,500, not the $18,100 that looked so promising on paper. And that figure doesn't include a single hour of his own time. Laura, over the same stretch, has put in her original $60,000 plus $12,600 in contributions. At a roughly 10% average annual return, her portfolio now sits near $91,000. She spent 0 hours managing anything. No phone calls, no emergencies, no lunch break contractor calls. James does still have one thing working powerfully in his favor: leverage. His $300,000 property has appreciated somewhere between 3% and 4% a year, and is now worth close to $328 to $336,000. His equity, what the house is worth, minus what he still owes, has climbed to roughly $65,000 to $73,000. That growth came partly from the bank's money, not just his own. And that's an advantage the stock market simply doesn't offer in the same form. It's worth pausing here, because this is exactly the point in the story where most real estate versus stocks comparisons quietly stop and declare a winner. James's equity number looks bigger than Laura's account balance, so the conclusion writes itself: real estate wins. But that comparison is incomplete in a way that matters enormously. Equity isn't cash. James can't spend that $65,000 without selling the house, refinancing it, or taking out a home equity loan, each of which comes with its own costs, paperwork, and risk. Laura's number, by contrast, is fully liquid. She could withdraw it tomorrow if she genuinely needed to, no lender required. Comparing a locked, illiquid number to a fully accessible one as if they're the same thing is where a lot of these online comparisons quietly go wrong. What the rent check never tells you the number everyone talks about is the rent check. It's the number in the thumbnail, the number at the real estate meetup, the number your cousin brings up at every holiday dinner. What almost nobody talks about is everything that quietly disappears from that rent check before any of it becomes profit. Vacancy. The average rental sits empty around 1 month per year. That's not catastrophic on its own, but it's a full mortgage payment with zero income arriving to cover it. Maintenance and repairs. The standard rule of thumb is 1% to 2% of the property's value annually. On a $300,000 house, that's $3,000 to $6,000 a year. Some years it's a $180 faucet. Other years it's a $6,500 HVAC replacement in the middle of August, arriving with no warning and no flexibility, because your tenant is not going to wait patiently for cooler weather. Capital expenditures. Roofs last roughly 20 to 25 years. Furnaces last 15 to 20. Water heaters last 10 to 12. These costs are not optional, and not surprising they are guaranteed, arriving in chunks of $5,000 to $15. If you're not setting money aside monthly for these, you're not running a business. You're gambling on timing. Property management. Hire someone, and that's typically 8 to 10% of monthly rent. Gone immediately. Manage it yourself, and you've taken on an unpaid part-time job. Either way, something is being spent money in one case, time in the other. Bad tenants. The risk nobody wants to bring up out loud. A tenant who stops paying and understands the eviction timeline can cost 3 to 6 months of lost rent plus legal fees. One bad tenant can erase an entire year of profit, sometimes more. None of this shows up in that clean $500 a month number, but eventually, every bit of it shows up somewhere. Here's a way to think about it that makes the gap easier to see. That advertised $500 a month cash flow figure is a gross number. It's what's left after only one expense, the mortgage. It's the equivalent of calculating your take-home pay by only subtracting rent and ignoring taxes, groceries, insurance, and everything else that leaves your account before payday even ends. Real estate investors don't do this to deceive anyone. They genuinely believe the gross number is the real number, because the hidden costs don't arrive on a predictable monthly schedule. They arrive in lumps, months or years apart, which makes them easy to mentally file away as bad luck rather than as the ordinary, expected cost of doing business. Year 5. The landlord reality sets in by year 5. James is fully living inside the reality of owning rental property. He's on his third tenant. He's replaced the roof for $9,200, handled a plumbing emergency for $1,600, and absorbed another month of vacancy between leases. He's raised the rent to $2,275, which genuinely helps, but property taxes and insurance have climbed right alongside it. His actual cash on cash, return what he pockets relative to what he originally invested, is sitting somewhere around 3 to 5% after real expenses. Not bad. Nowhere close to the 15 to 20% number that gets thrown around at barbecues. Laura is still doing, functionally, nothing. Her portfolio has grown from $60,000 to somewhere between $148,000 and $165,000 by year 7. Contributions included. She didn't pick individual stocks. She didn't try to time anything. Her only strategy was leaving it alone. The compounding is starting to accelerate. The gains on her gains are now producing more new wealth each year than her original contributions ever did. Here's what's actually happening underneath both of their numbers. James's wealth is growing, but slowly, after expenses, and it demands constant attention to keep growing at all. Laura's wealth is growing along a curve slow and unremarkable for the first several years, then increasingly dramatic. Compounding is boring for roughly the first 5 years, and genuinely startling for the 15 after that. Year 10, surprisingly close by year 10, James's property is worth somewhere between $402,000 and $420,000. His remaining mortgage balance is around $199,000. That puts his equity at approximately $203,000 to $221,000. Across those 10 years, after every real cost mortgage interest, taxes, insurance, repairs, vacancy, capital expenditures, his total out-of-pocket spending beyond the original down payment lands somewhere between $24,000 and $38,000. Laura's portfolio, with consistent $350 monthly contributions and a roughly 10% average annual return, is sitting near $198,000 to $216,000. She put in $60,000 up front, plus $42,000 in contributions, $102,000 total. Everything above that is pure compound growth, and she spent exactly 0 weekends fixing anything. At year 10, they're remarkably close in total wealth. James may be a little ahead, largely thanks to leverage, but he's also logged hundreds of hours managing the property, taken on nearly $200,000 in debt, and concentrated his entire investment in one house, in one zip code, exposed to one local market. Laura is spread across thousands of companies and hasn't lost a night of sleep over any single one of them. There's a risk dimension buried in that last sentence that deserves more attention than it usually gets. James's entire outcome now depends heavily on the economic health of one specific neighborhood in one specific city. If the local employer that anchors that area shuts down, if a new development floods the rental market with competing units, if the school district's reputation declines, James's equity and his rental income both take the hit simultaneously, at the same time, from the same cause. Laura's risk is spread across thousands of companies, dozens of industries, and multiple countries. A single bad local event can meaningfully damage James's net worth. The same kind of localized event barely registers in Laura's portfolio at all. Year 20, where the story really splits by year 20, James's property is worth roughly $500,000 to $580,000. His mortgage is paid off or close to it. His equity sits somewhere between $500,000 and $570,000, depending on how the local market performed. He's collected rent that entire time, but after 2 decades of maintenance, turnover, taxes, insurance, and at least one major renovation, his total net profit from cash flow alone might land around $45,000 to $85,000 above what he actually spent. Possibly more in a strong market, possibly less in a flat one. Laura's portfolio, at that same 10% average annual return with $350 monthly contributions, has grown from her original $60,000 to somewhere near $490,000 to $535,000. Total contributions across 20 years, $144,000. Everything past that well over $350,000 is pure compounding. No debt, no tenants, no calls about a broken pipe at midnight. When you compare total net worth at the 20-year mark, they land in roughly the same range, somewhere between $500,000 and $580,000 each. But how they arrived there could not look more different. James worked for his number. Laura waited for hers. James carried stress, concentrated risk, and an illiquid asset he couldn't sell in a weekend if he needed cash. Laura carried volatility, but she also carried liquidity and freedom the entire way. And here's the detail that changes the math more than almost anything else in this comparison. If Laura had simply increased her monthly contribution by $150, bringing it to $500 a month, her 20-year total climbs to somewhere near $630,000 to $680,000. In the stock market, raising your contribution has a multiplied effect through compounding. In real estate, raising your investment usually means buying an entirely second property, a second mortgage, a second tenant, a doubled workload. Being honest about both sides, if I only walked you through the downsides of real estate, I'd be doing exactly what every Just Buy index funds video does. Stocks carry real, serious risks that get glossed over constantly. Volatility is brutal, full stop. In 2008, the market fell roughly 37%. In March 2020, it dropped 34% in a matter of weeks. If Laura had $180,000 sitting in her account and watched it fall to $115,000 within a month, that is not an abstract number on a screen. That is a genuinely gut-wrenching experience. And the data backs this up clearly. Most retail investors panic sell during crashes and buy back in after the recovery has already happened, locking in losses at the worst possible moment. There's also no cash flow. Unlike a rental property, Index funds don't mail you a spendable check every month. Dividends exist. But on a total market fund, you're typically looking at a 1.5 to 2% yield. On a $180,000 balance, that's roughly $250 a month, not enough to replace anyone's income. There's no leverage, either. Laura used $60,000 to control $60,000 in assets. James used $60,000 to control $300,000 in assets. That 5-to-1 leverage is enormously powerful when property values are rising, and it's a major reason real estate produces so many self-made millionaires. And there's no equivalent of depreciation in the stock market. Real estate investors can deduct a theoretical decline in a building's value from their taxable income, even while the property is actually appreciating in the real world. That's a legitimate, legal tax advantage stock investors simply don't have access to. Where real estate genuinely wins in specific, identifiable situations. If you're buying in a market where the rent-to-price ratio is strong, meaning monthly rent sits around 0.8% to 1% of the purchase price, the cash flow math works in your favor from day one instead of fighting you for years. If you're willing to treat it as an actual business, rather than a side hobby, screening tenants carefully, budgeting seriously for capital expenditures, building real systems, the returns can outpace stocks, especially with leverage doing its part. If you use house hacking, living in one unit while renting out the others, you can push your own housing cost close to zero while still building equity, something the stock market has no equivalent for. And if you understand 1031 exchanges, which let you defer capital gains taxes by rolling profits into a new property, you can keep growing a real estate portfolio without the tax drag that stock investors face outside of retirement accounts. Real estate isn't a bad investment. It's a widely misunderstood one. The real trap: James and Laura both walked away from their original decision, believing they'd made the smart play. James believed real estate was the proven path to wealth. Laura believed the stock market would simply do the work for her. Neither of them sat down and actually mapped out the full cost in dollars, in time, in stress, in risk across 10 or 20 years. The real trap was never real estate, and it was never stocks either. The real trap is choosing one or the other based on a YouTube title, a podcast clip, or something a relative said with total confidence at Thanksgiving dinner, without ever running the complete numbers for your own specific situation. There's one more layer worth naming honestly before we wrap up. The right answer isn't even fixed for a single person over time. The version of James who's 28, single and willing to spend Saturday mornings fixing a fence, is a completely different investor than the version of James who's 45, has 2 kids, and can't afford to lose a weekend to a plumbing emergency. The version of Laura who's just starting her career and can absorb a 35% market drop without touching her portfolio is different from the version of Laura 5 years from retirement, who suddenly needs that money to behave predictably. The right tool depends on your season of life, just as much as it depends on the raw math, and that's precisely the piece a 10-minute video with a confident title can never actually calculate for you. And if you're wondering what happens when someone both owns property and invests in the market at the same time, that's an entirely different conversation, and the math there might surprise you even more than this one did. But for now, the next time someone tells you real estate always wins, or the stock market always wins, ask them exactly one question. Did you include everything? Because the answer that accounts for everything is the only answer that actually matters